Fernanda Maciel. On Saturday, February 10, 2018, a woman sat down to enjoy a simple meal of beans and pico de gallo, lovingly made by her mother, Paula. After eating, she stepped outside the house. The photos taken that day would be the last ever captured of her. Her disappearance quickly captivated the nation of Chile, stirring both widespread interest and deep concern. Fernanda Maciel was a small woman, reportedly under 5 feet tall. But what made her vanishing especially shocking was that she was 32 weeks, or 7 months, pregnant. What left both investigators and the public baffled was the absence of any clear reason for her disappearance. She was in a happy relationship with a boyfriend her family supported, and they were getting ready to move into a new home together. But when the truth about what happened to Fernanda came to light, it was so chilling that it shook the entire country. A word of caution: some of the following details are deeply unsettling. On the day Fernanda disappeared, her mother, Paula, noticed something unusual. Fernanda was unusually quiet. Paula later recalled that her daughter didn't interact with her younger siblings the way she normally did. There were no casual conversations or playful moments. She simply ate in silence. Then, at exactly 5:29 p.m., Fernanda left their home on Paniego Street, taking only her phone and keys with her. She crossed the intersection onto La Lima Road, a path she had taken countless times before. But this time, she never came back. Paula waited for hours, her worry growing with each passing minute. When Fernanda's phone began going straight to voicemail, it became clear that something was wrong. The fact that she was nearing the end of her pregnancy made the situation all the more alarming. On February 11th, the day after Fernanda vanished, her mother Paula and her boyfriend Luis Peterson, who was also the father of her unborn child, filed a missing persons report. Chile's national police force, the Carabineros, began the investigation. However, since there were no immediate signs of foul play, the more specialized unit, the Policía de Investigaciones de Chile, PDI, was not yet involved. The Carabineros distributed missing person posters, circulated information on social media, and interviewed residents in the area. Their most significant lead came from security footage confirming that Fernanda was last seen crossing Pago Street at 5:29 p.m. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. Oddly, no additional surveillance cameras picked up her movements after that. A local resident, Ortega Migno, claimed he saw her walking toward the Andes Mountains, but that lead went nowhere. Despite persistent search efforts, weeks passed, then months, with no significant progress. Fernanda's social media accounts remained silent, her bank activity was non-existent, and no reliable sightings were reported. As her due date approached, the disappearance grew even more baffling. Many feared the worst, but Fernanda's family refused to lose hope. They remained unwavering in their efforts, determined to find answers and bring her home. To fully grasp the circumstances surrounding Fernanda's disappearance, it's important to delve into her background. Fernanda Damaris Maciel Correa was born on September 5, 1996, in Independencia, Santiago, Chile. After her parents separated in 1999, her mother Paula raised Fernanda and her siblings on her own, eventually relocating the family to Calicura. At first, Fernanda adapted well to these changes. She performed well in school, had a bright and positive personality, and maintained a relationship with her father. However, things began to shift during her teenage years. Her academic performance declined, she became more irritable, and tensions with classmates, siblings, and even her mother grew more frequent. Worried about her daughter's well-being, Paula turned to school counselors for support. In February 2007, Fernanda was enrolled in a program designed for at-risk youth, but the intervention failed to make a lasting difference. She frequently stayed out late and sometimes didn't come home at all. Police often found her with teenagers who were involved in drug use, and over time, Fernanda began to adopt their habits, gradually falling into substance abuse herself. Though she continued living with her family, Fernanda became increasingly distant. She spent most of her time sleeping and only left the house to meet friends and feed her addiction. Her school performance worsened, eventually forcing her to repeat a grade. Then, tragedy struck. On July 2, 2012, her father passed away suddenly from a stroke. Heartbroken, she got a tattoo of his name in his memory, but his death only deepened her downward spiral of self-destruction. Family members tried to intervene, but their efforts often led to explosive arguments. She began drinking heavily, frequently spending nights away from home. Despite these struggles, she managed to barely graduate high school and eventually found a job as a nightclub hostess. Unfortunately, the environment only reinforced her unhealthy lifestyle. She went through a series of unstable relationships, continuing on a downward spiral until she met Luis Peterson, a 36-year-old taxi driver. Luis seemed to genuinely care for Fernanda, and he even gained Paula's trust, becoming a welcome presence in their home. Under his influence, Fernanda started turning her life around. She reduced her drug use significantly. And while her relationship with Luis wasn't without occasional drama, it was relatively stable. Jealousy sometimes caused tension, such as the time Fernandez scratched Luis's taxi in a fit of rage, but such incidents were rare. Eventually, she left her nightclub job and took a position as a waitress at a local restaurant, a healthier work environment. However, when her employer discovered she was pregnant, she was fired. This time, instead of falling back into old patterns, Fernanda fought back. She filed a complaint with the labor inspectorate and was successfully reinstated at her job. By the time of her disappearance, Fernanda had made significant strides in turning her life around. She was determined to create a better future and was eagerly anticipating the birth of her baby daughter. As weeks passed with no sign of her, frustration within her family grew. On March 5, 2018, after nearly a month of unanswered questions, Fernanda's relatives officially filed a complaint against the Carabineros, criticizing their handling of the case. This led to the involvement of the Policía de Investigaciones de Chile, PDI, a more specialized investigative unit known for solving complex criminal cases. The PDI wasted no time in exploring multiple theories to explain Fernanda's disappearance. One of the earliest theories was that she had simply run away, possibly after an argument with Luis or to reunite with a former lover. This idea gained traction in the media when a couple vacationing in San Carlos de Bariloche, Argentina, claimed to have seen a woman resembling Fernanda, who appeared to have undergone cosmetic surgery. Desperate for answers, Paula traveled to Argentina to investigate the lead. However, after extensive searching, she firmly dismissed the runaway theory. She insisted Fernanda would never have left home without her belongings and had been excited about moving into the new home Luis was building for their growing family. The next theory investigators examined was the drug connection. Although Fernanda had distanced herself from that lifestyle, rumors surfaced that she had been spotted with a known drug dealer, Alexander Oyesen, and his partner, Maria Aria, the day before she vanished. Witnesses claimed she had been holding a package during their meeting. However, both Oyesen and Aria provided solid alibis and were eventually ruled out. Attention then shifted to Joel Cuevas Flores, a local drug trafficker, and one of Fernandez's former romantic partners. There were allegations that Cuevas' girlfriend, Francesca Orellana, had threatened Fernanda a year before she disappeared. However, during questioning, while both were in custody for unrelated charges, investigators found no connection between them and Fernanda's case, leading to their clearance as suspects. Another possibility was the accident theory. Some speculated that Fernanda might have suffered a fatal accident while traveling along the road that day. However, there was no physical evidence to support this idea, and security cameras failed to capture any unusual incidents. With no signs of a crash, investigators dismissed this theory rather quickly. Some also considered the possibility that Fernanda had taken her own life. However, her friends and family strongly rejected this idea, emphasizing that she had been excited about her pregnancy and actively planning for her baby's future. Additionally, there was no history of severe depression that would suggest such an outcome. A kidnapping theory was also explored, but the lack of ransom demands or any physical evidence made this scenario highly unlikely. Lastly, detectives weighed the possibility that her past drug use, if not her own, then her past associations might have led to a violent retaliation, perhaps over unresolved debts. Yet, as with all other theories, no concrete evidence emerged to support this claim. With these leads exhausted, investigators turned their focus to specific individuals in Fernanda's life. Several potential suspects surfaced, each with possible motives and opportunities. The first was her boyfriend, Luis Peterson. While their relationship seemed stable, it wasn't without problems. Friends revealed that Fernanda had expressed concerns about Luis's temper, describing him as sometimes controlling and verbally aggressive. Luis admitted they had arguments, but denied ever being physically abusive. "We had our disagreements like any couple," he stated, "but we were excited about our daughter's birth." Authorities conducted a thorough investigation verifying his alibi, which placed him far from Fernanda's last known location. Despite lingering doubts about the nature of their relationship, no evidence linked him to any wrongdoing, and he was eventually ruled out as a suspect. Another suspect was a local taxi driver who had interacted with Fernanda frequently. Friends reported that he had been overly persistent, frequently asking for her number and offering her baby clothes. However, the driver denied harassing her, claiming that she had willingly shared her contact information with him after he had once driven her to a hospital for a medical issue. Despite his claims, recovered text messages from Fernanda's phone suggested she had accused him of being too pushy. Even so, the driver provided a verifiable alibi, and forensic tests on his vehicle found no evidence of foul play. As a result, he too was ruled out. The next group of individuals under scrutiny were Fernanda's co-workers at the restaurant where she was employed. While some acknowledged her recent attempts to improve her life, others described her as difficult to work with, citing frequent disputes over tips and tardiness. One supervisor admitted, "None of us really liked her." However, investigators found no clear motive or opportunity linking her disappearance to any of her colleagues, and they were all eventually ruled out. But there was one person in Fernanda's life who stood out, her longtime friend and neighbor, Felipe Andres Rojas Lobos. The two had known each other for over a decade, and on the day she went missing, it was widely known that she had planned to meet him at the winery and warehouse where he worked. Security footage captured Fernanda walking in that direction at 5:29 p.m. But, curiously, there was no footage of her actually entering the warehouse. When questioned, Felipe admitted that he had planned to meet Fernanda that day, but claimed she never showed up. At 8:05 p.m., he even sent her a WhatsApp message saying, "You never came, dude. I waited for you secretly." However, investigators found his version of events suspicious and decided to take a closer look at his actions in the days that followed. Just 2 days later, surveillance footage showed Felipe carrying a 25-kilogram bag of cement into the warehouse, a recent purchase that had no connection to his job duties. This raised immediate red flags. Then on February 13th, he was caught on camera inspecting security cameras along Lalama Street, appearing to check whether they had recorded the warehouse entrance. Even more incriminating was the fact that he had enlisted the help of a friend, Christian Lobos Trujillo, to assist him. Christian later told the police that Felipe had specifically asked whether the cameras were pointed at the warehouse. The following day, February 14th, Felipe abruptly resigned from his job. This was unusual because when he had first been hired, he assured his employers that he intended to stay for at least a year. His sudden departure added to the growing suspicions around him. Early in the investigation, the Carabineros had conducted searches at both the warehouse and Felipe's home, but had found no concrete evidence of foul play. Still, the PDI remained skeptical of his alibi even as the case went cold and updates became scarce. Then nearly 16 months later, in June 2019, a breakthrough occurred. A woman came forward with a shocking testimony. Wishing to remain anonymous, she was referred to as Nancy. She revealed that Felipe had confessed to her about killing Fernanda. According to Nancy, Felipe admitted that he had indeed met Fernanda at the warehouse on February 10th. They smoked a joint together and talked, but the conversation took a dark turn when Felipe brought up his ex-girlfriend who he claimed was extorting him. Fernanda allegedly became confrontational, and in the heat of the moment, Felipe pushed her. She fell, hitting her head against a piece of furniture and started convulsing. Panicking, Felipe tried to help her, but when she became unresponsive, he didn't know what to do. In his frantic state, he decided to bury her in the warehouse's backyard. Initially, when Nancy confronted him about his confession, he insisted he had made it up out of stress. At first, she believed him, but as time passed, she noticed a change in his behavior. He was constantly paranoid, always looking over his shoulder. "He kept begging me not to tell anyone what he said," she recalled. "That's when I realized he wasn't lying. He might have actually done it." Acting on Nancy's tip, investigators returned to the warehouse on June 24, 2019. What they found not only confirmed their worst fears, it was far more disturbing than Nancy had described. That day, forensic teams and police officers arrived at the warehouse on La Lima Street and began excavating the backyard, which was littered with rubble and partially covered by overgrown bushes. Carefully, they used hand tools to clear the area, digging about 35 centimeters into the soil when they struck something solid. Beneath the dirt, they uncovered a concrete slab measuring approximately 115 by 50 centimeters with a thickness of 5 centimeters. What they would discover beneath it would finally reveal the tragic fate of Fernanda. As investigators continued digging, they noticed a whitish powder later confirmed to be lime. They carefully excavated further until they uncovered a white shoe still attached to a human foot. This was the first undeniable indication that they had found a body. As they dug deeper, they discovered a white tarp tightly wrapped around the remains. The body was positioned in a forced fetal posture with the hands bound by cloth. Despite the time that had passed, it was remarkably well preserved, almost unmistakably Fernanda. Her dress had been pulled up to her waist, exposing her lower body, and her underwear was torn and displaced. These details strongly suggested that she had been the victim of a violent assault before her death. Investigators noted that the body appeared mummified, seemingly preserved by the lime and cement that had encased it. Paula, Fernanda's mother, was immediately called to the scene. Upon arrival, she was devastated. She recognized Fernanda's earrings and clothing at first sight. Forensic experts then confirmed what the family had feared. Through fingerprint analysis and identifying tattoos, the remains were officially identified as Fernanda Maciel Correa. A preliminary examination was conducted by the on-site forensic team led by Dr. Vivian Bustos Bacurezzo. The mummified state of the body, devoid of insect activity, indicated that it had been buried shortly after death, minimizing exposure to external elements. During the autopsy, a crucial discovery was made: a fracture in Fernanda's hyoid bone, a U-shaped structure in the neck above the larynx. This type of fracture is commonly linked to strangulation. Further analysis revealed hemorrhagic infiltrates, areas of internal bleeding within the neck muscles, including the sternothyroid and sternohyoid. Additionally, compression injuries were observed in the larynx and trachea, confirming that Fernanda had been strangled either manually or with a ligature. Around her neck, investigators found a piece of tightly knotted canvas, which had been used to strangle her. The force applied was enough to fracture her hyoid bone and inflict other visible injuries. Experts concluded that the strangulation had likely induced premature labor, causing her water to break. Tragically deprived of oxygen, the fetus suffocated as amniotic fluid filled its lungs. Due to the pressure from the cement slab and surrounding soil compressing Fernanda's body, the fetus was expelled post-mortem. Near the burial site, investigators found crucial evidence: a set of rusty keys with a heart-shaped keychain that belonged to Fernanda, a black bra, and pink underwear, both torn, bearing clear signs of a violent struggle. Additionally, they uncovered a cement wrapper from the brand San Juan, matching the cement Felipe had purchased on February 12, 2018. These findings painted a grim picture of both premeditation and an attempt to conceal a brutal crime. Surveillance footage played a vital role in piecing together the timeline of Fernanda's disappearance. The evidence against Felipe was mounting, and the investigation was closing in on the truth. On February 10, 2018, surveillance footage captured Felipe arriving at the warehouse on his bicycle. Just 12 minutes later, Fernanda was recorded leaving her home, making her way towards the warehouse and crossing Pago Street before disappearing from view behind dense vegetation. At 5:33 p.m., two dogs were seen exiting the warehouse, likely let out by Felipe after Fernanda had been led inside. Between 5:33 p.m. and 7:34 p.m., the crime is believed to have taken place. At 7:34 p.m., Felipe was seen leaving the warehouse on his bicycle. However, instead of heading directly home, which was located right next to Fernanda's house, he took a longer, circular route. Investigators later interpreted this as an attempt to avoid suspicion, possibly driven by guilt. 2 days later, on February 12th, Felipe was caught on camera purchasing a 25-kilogram bag of San Juan cement from a hardware store in Conchili. The light blue bag bearing the same brand logo was later discovered at the crime scene. He returned to the store shortly afterward, this time purchasing mortar. Both times, he transported the materials by bicycle. The following day, February 13th, he was seen inspecting surveillance cameras along the street. And on February 14th, he suddenly resigned from his job at the warehouse. Investigators believe these actions were deliberate attempts to cover his tracks and evade detection. Felipe Andres Rojas Lobos went on trial on March 6, 2013, facing overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. The case involved testimony from over 58 witnesses and the expertise of 41 forensic specialists. Prosecutors underscored the brutality of the crime, emphasizing Fernandez's vulnerability as a pregnant woman who had trusted Felipe, a longtime friend of more than a decade. Despite his lawyer's attempts to request a retrial, the evidence against him was damning. The prosecution pushed for the harshest sentence possible, citing the premeditated nature of the crime, his complete lack of remorse, and the sheer brutality of what had occurred. Felipe's inconsistent and delayed statements further damaged his credibility. He failed to provide a clear account of events until December 20, 2020, nearly 34 months after Fernandez's disappearance. By that time, investigators had already uncovered crucial evidence, including the location of her body, the cause of death, and the fact that he was the only person with access to the warehouse that day. His late testimony held little value compared to the facts already established. Cesar Gonzalez, the warehouse owner, and Christian Rivera, the manager, confirmed that both were on vacation that day, leaving Felipe as the sole person with keys to the warehouse. He had been tasked with handling odd jobs and taking care of the dogs. Furthermore, Fernanda had confided in her close friend Nicholas that she was going to meet Felipe at the warehouse, further placing him at the scene. The condition of Fernanda's body painted a chilling picture of what had transpired. Her dress had been pulled up, exposing her lower body, and her torn underwear strongly suggested sexual violence. These signs pointed to an even more horrific crime than what Felipe had confessed to Nancy. Additionally, he repeatedly lied to investigators and Fernanda's mother, insisting that she had never arrived at the warehouse despite knowing she was already dead. Felipe had sent multiple WhatsApp messages to Fernanda on the day she disappeared, and afterward, pretending he had no knowledge of what had happened to her. Additionally, he asked a company employee to provide false information about the time he returned the warehouse keys. To friends and family, he feigned concern over Fernandez's disappearance while fabricating excuses for purchasing lime, claiming his boss had instructed him to buy it for painting a grotto, which was later proven false. He also misled his ex-girlfriend, Nancy, initially telling her that Fernanda had died accidentally after hitting her head, only to later alter his story. Evidence further revealed his attempts to manipulate witnesses, including urging Nancy to lie to authorities about the body's location as confirmed by several audio recordings. His actions following the crime also raised suspicion. On February 12th, he called his boss, Christian Rivera, requesting permission to leave and search for Fernanda. However, security footage contradicted his claim. He never left the warehouse. Instead, he was seen entering twice, carrying what appeared to be cement and mortar bags before finally leaving at 4:18 p.m. This further reinforced the prosecution's assertion that he was preparing to bury her body rather than looking for her. Throughout the investigation, Felipe displayed a chilling lack of empathy or remorse. Witnesses described him as manipulative and emotionless, with one even recalling that he joked about Fernandez's fate, saying, "She's now cooking somewhere." Prosecutors argued that Felipe was a narcissistic psychopath who viewed his actions with disturbing detachment. Based on months of investigation, prosecutors pieced together Fernandez's final moments in horrifying detail. On February 10, 2018, she left her home unaware that she was walking into a trap. Felipe, a neighbor and longtime friend she had known for over a decade, lured her to a warehouse at 1635 Lolema Street in Conchili. Carrying only her keys and phone, Fernanda had no reason to suspect the nightmare that awaited her. The evidence suggested that Felipe had premeditated the crime. In the days leading up to their meeting, he had already dug a grave in the warehouse courtyard, precisely sized to fit Fernanda's body. This level of preparation indicated that he had intended to kill her and dispose of her remains well before their encounter. Around 5:30 p.m., Fernanda arrived at the warehouse. Just 3 minutes later, at 5:33 p.m., Felipe let the dogs out, likely to ensure they wouldn't interfere with what he was about to do. Once she was inside, he betrayed her trust in an unimaginably brutal way. Using his significant physical advantage, he stood over 6 feet tall while Fernanda was just 5 feet. He attacked her from behind. As she struggled, he assaulted her, then tied her up and strangled her until she lost consciousness. The official autopsy determined that Fernanda died from asphyxiation caused by strangulation. However, forensic expert Dr. Carmen Cerda later raised the disturbing possibility that she may have still been alive when she was buried. Evidence pointed to death by suffocation, likely from being tightly wrapped in cloth and forced into a fetal position that restricted her ability to breathe. Felipe believed she was dead after the violent assault, but in truth, she may have suffocated slowly in the shallow grave. Her unborn daughter, with no chance of survival, died from drowning in amniotic fluid. Every move Felipe made to conceal his crime was later traced. He had purchased cement and floor mortar, items that, along with their receipts, were eventually found at the crime scene. The fact that he left behind such vital evidence was shockingly careless. Fernanda's unborn daughter had already been given a name, chosen with love before this unimaginable tragedy. She was to be welcomed into the world as baby Josefa. On April 25, 2023, the court handed down the harshest possible sentence to Felipe Andrés Rojas Lobos, qualified life imprisonment. The decision was based on the extreme cruelty of his actions, the aggravating elements of premeditation and certainty, and the critical need to preserve public confidence in the justice system. Moving on to the next case. Michelle Bright. A girl attended a birthday party and then disappeared without a trace. For more than 2 decades, the case remained unsolved, baffling investigators who uncovered unsettling clues but couldn't piece together the full story. Then, in a dramatic development straight out of a crime thriller, the investigation took a bold new direction. Detectives launched a high-stakes undercover operation, and through their meticulous and daring efforts, the truth finally came to light. Michelle Bright was born on February 6, 1981, in the small Australian town of Goolgong. With a population of just around 2,500, it was a tight-knit community far removed from the bustle of big cities. Everyone knew one another, and because of its isolated location, strangers were a rare sight. Michelle lived there with her parents and 2 older brothers. She went to the local school, had a wide circle of friends, played basketball, and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Her passion for animals was so strong that she even had a horse of her own. Michelle had big dreams for the future. She often said she wanted to have a large family, with 6 children of her own. By 1999, at 17 years old, she was focused on her education and determined to earn high marks in hopes of being accepted into veterinary school. On February 26th, she planned to attend a friend's birthday party. The evening's plan was simple. She'd go to the celebration at a friend's house, then spend the night at another friend's place since her home was quite a distance away. That evening, Michelle's mother drove her to the party, as Michelle didn't yet have a car of her own. Before getting out of the vehicle, she told her mom she'd see her the next morning, and they said their goodbyes. But when Michelle's mom woke up the following day, she noticed her daughter hadn't returned home. At first, she assumed Michelle was simply sleeping in at her friend's house. However, as the hours passed with no word, her concern began to grow. Michelle didn't own a cell phone, so around noon, her mother began calling her friends to find out where she was. Eventually, Michelle's mother discovered that her daughter had left the party around 12:30 a.m. with a couple who had offered to drop her off in the town center. From there, it was just a short walk to her other friend's house, where Michelle planned to spend the night. But to her mother's shock, she learned that Michelle never arrived. The realization filled her with dread. Still clinging to hope, she began calling more of Michelle's friends, thinking perhaps she had decided to stay somewhere else instead. But none of them had seen or heard from Michelle that night. By the time she had contacted everyone she could think of, hours had gone by, and there was still no sign of her daughter. With nowhere else to turn, she went to the police to report Michelle missing, but she was met with immediate resistance. Local officers dismissed her concerns, assuming Michelle had either run off with friends or left home voluntarily. Despite her repeated pleas and insistence that Michelle would never disappear without a word, the authorities refused to begin a search. With no help from the authorities, Michelle's mother and other family members took matters into their own hands. They began searching tirelessly, speaking with residents and scouring the streets, hoping to find any trace of her. Days passed without progress, until the evening of March 2nd. That night, a man was out walking his dog along a road just outside of town. As he passed an old railway near a field, something unusual in the tall grass caught his attention. As he moved closer, he made a horrifying discovery. It was a human body. He immediately contacted the police. When officers arrived, they quickly identified the victim as Michelle Bright. Her clothes were partially missing, and her bra had been torn off. Nearby, they found her bag, but there were no other immediate clues left at the scene. One chilling detail stood out. Michelle's body had been left less than half a mile from her own home. Due to the dense, overgrown grass, Michelle's body had been nearly impossible to see from a distance. The medical examiner found multiple bruises on her body and determined that she had been strangled. They also concluded that she had been sexually assaulted. However, there was no biological evidence left behind that could identify the attacker. A few strands of hair were found in Michelle's hand, possibly pulled during a struggle, but attempts to extract DNA from them were unsuccessful. Now that the case had shifted from a disappearance to a homicide, police finally launched a full investigation. Their first step was to question everyone who had attended the party that night. Experts estimated that Michelle had likely been killed the same night she vanished, suggesting that someone at the party could have been involved, or at least knew more than they let on. When interviewed, partygoers all claimed the evening had been calm, with no signs of trouble. No one reported seeing Michelle in any arguments or confrontations. By all accounts, she had been in a good mood and left the gathering with a couple who had offered to give her a ride. The police spoke with this couple, and they confirmed that they dropped Michelle off on the main street in town, where she planned to walk to her friend's house. After that, they drove off and didn't see which direction she went. Her friend told investigators that Michelle never made it to her place that night. The investigators suspected that either she was attacked before she could reach her friend's house, or for some reason Michelle changed her mind and decided to head home instead. The investigators doubted that the victim could have been attacked in the middle of the street. They interviewed everyone who lived nearby, and no one heard any screams or unusual noises. Because of this, the police believe that Michelle might have known her attacker. It's possible he offered her a ride home and instead drove her to the location where her body would later be found. Michelle's family also insisted that she would never have gotten into a car with a stranger. Besides, in their small town, outsiders were rare, so she would have recognized anyone local. Over the next few weeks, the police continued questioning experts couldn't obtain a DNA sample from the killer. This information wasn't made public. The investigators hoped that as DNA analysis technology advanced, they might be able to extract a genetic profile of the perpetrator from the victim's belongings or another evidence. One of the first suspects was Michelle's ex-boyfriend. The police found out that she had broken up with him shortly before her death, and according to their friends, he wasn't happy about it. But there was no evidence against him, and investigators couldn't determine whether he had the opportunity to be on the street where Michelle was walking the night she was killed. Another local resident raised suspicion because he seemed overly distraught about Michelle's death, even though they barely knew each other. But like with her ex-boyfriend, there was no way to connect this man to the murder. Interestingly, a few days after the body was found, one of Michelle's relatives visited the site. He noticed one of her earrings on the ground, which was strange because the police had already searched the entire area. Either they missed the shiny piece of jewelry, or the killer had taken it with them initially, and later decided to return it to the scene to dispose of the evidence. Over the next few months, investigators compiled a list of 14 suspects, but they struggled to connect any of them to the crime. Without a DNA sample from the killer or other significant evidence, finding the culprit seemed like an almost impossible task. All the suspects voluntarily provided their DNA samples, except for one. A 23-year-old man named Mark refused to give a sample, which made the investigators take a closer look at him. Shortly after Michelle's death, it came to light that Mark had been stalking a local woman for 8 months, even breaking into her home. Later, he was accused of harassing another woman in a nearby town. He followed her down the street, then caught up to her and started touching her. Although there wasn't enough evidence to charge him in that case, it gave the investigators in Michelle's case even more reason to be suspicious. They also discovered that Mark had been in the same class as Michelle's older brother, which meant he could have known her family well. Mark claimed that he was indeed in the town center that evening, but got home around 1:15 a.m., meaning he wouldn't have had enough time to kidnap Michelle, drive her to that field, and kill her. However, when investigators spoke with his wife, they found out something interesting. She said she wasn't sure about the time and suggested that he might have come home much later. This prompted the police to install a wiretap in Mark's house, which led to another alarming discovery. It turned out that his wife also had doubts about his honesty and had repeatedly questioned him about whether he was involved in the murder. Eventually, she convinced Mark to provide a DNA sample, but just a day before his meeting with the police, he crashed his car into a tree. Investigators suspected it might have been intentional, but a few days later, Mark did hand over his DNA sample after all. Despite his suspicious behavior, the investigators still lacked the killer's DNA, and without it, or any other solid evidence, they couldn't arrest Mark. Since then, the case saw almost no progress. The police continued to investigate various suspects, but nothing led to any breakthroughs. About a year after the murder, Michelle's family decided to move to another city. They were convinced that the killer was someone local, and it became too difficult for them to stay among people they suspected. In February, a substantial reward of $100,000 was offered for any information leading to the capture of the culprit. This brought in several new leads, but all of them ended up going nowhere. In February 2002, investigators traveled to the UK to analyze the victim's belongings and other evidence for any foreign DNA, but this too yielded no results. The case was reopened several times over the years. In February 2009, the reward was increased to $500,000, setting a record for the state. This huge amount of money generated a flood of new tips and calls, but none of them brought investigators any closer to catching the killer. In 2019, 20 years after the murder, the case was reopened once again. The police still didn't have the killer's DNA, as even with modern tools, they couldn't find any foreign DNA on the victim's belongings. Given this, detectives turned their attention back to the list of suspects, which at that point had 5 names. After thoroughly re-examining each of these men, they narrowed the list down to just 2 suspects and focused their efforts on them. One of them was a 56-year-old man named Craig. He became a suspect for several reasons. At the time of Michelle's murder, he lived just 2 houses away from her. What's more, Craig moved to Sydney just 2 weeks after the crime. Craig also had a significant criminal record. He had been arrested multiple times for harassment, indecent exposure, and other similar offenses. On top of that, he was involved in various illegal activities, like thefts. Moreover, Craig had been a suspect in another assault case involving a woman from Galgong just a year before Michelle's death. In that incident, the woman had returned home after a party and was sitting on her porch waiting for her boyfriend to arrive. At some point, a man, later identified as Craig, approached her, struck her, and attempted to assault her. Fortunately, her boyfriend arrived just in time, scaring off the attacker. Although the woman initially reported the assault to the police, she ultimately decided not to press charges. The problem was that the chances of securing a conviction against Craig were low, as her testimony alone wouldn't have been enough. As a result, no charges were filed, and Craig remained free. For the investigators working on Michelle's case, Craig was their prime suspect, but they needed a confession from him. So the detectives decided to take a bold and risky step. They planned a large-scale undercover operation. Given Craig's criminal history, the investigators decided to set up a sting operation. They created a fake criminal group and approached Craig, presenting themselves as an organization with serious connections, including ties to the police. They also claimed that they were looking to make a lot of money and needed one more member. Craig was intrigued by the offer and joined the gang. Over the next few months, the undercover operatives focused on gaining his trust. They kept telling him that their group was like family, and if he couldn't be fully trusted, he wouldn't be involved in the major operations. During this period, the group committed a series of crimes, but the police didn't reveal any specific details. It's possible that these crimes were staged or involved minor thefts, with the detectives willing to go to such lengths to solve the murder case. This continued for almost a year, and the investigators decided it was time to move to the next phase. The gang members told Craig that the police were interested in him because of some old murder, which threatened their entire operation. They didn't provide any details, but implied that investigators were getting closer. During one of these conversations, Craig said, "I hope they won't question me about the murder of Michelle Bright." He then added that she was like a sister to him and that he had known her since she was a baby. Sometime later, another undercover officer, posing as a corrupt detective working for the gang, met with Craig. He told him that investigators from a small town were actively digging into him regarding the old murder and that they were closing in. Eventually, the detectives moved to the third step. They held a press conference announcing a record-breaking reward of $1 million for information about Michelle's murder. This was done to ensure the case made headlines across Australia and to increase Craig's anxiety. Interestingly, on the same day, Craig left a comment on the police social media post saying, "It's so sad that they haven't caught our killer. Michelle was like a sister to me. I feel sorry for the family." The next day, Craig was set up to meet with a gang leader, whom he had never seen in person. The role of the gang leader was played by one of the investigators. The fake boss told Craig that the police were interested in him for 2 separate cases, putting the entire gang at risk. He asked Craig to be completely honest and confess if he was involved. In return, he promised to help Craig resolve the situation. But despite this, Craig continued to deny any involvement in the murder. During the conversation, the fake boss showed him a folder with police materials on Michelle's case, including a photo of Craig's old car. In 1999, shortly after Craig's move to Sydney, the police had contacted him by phone regarding the investigation, and the next day, his car was found burned. The boss claimed they had some evidence and that Craig could be arrested very soon. The police materials seemed to have had their effect, and Craig finally began to confess. He recounted that on the night of the murder, he had arrived in Gulgong, visited a friend, and then headed to the town center, where he stopped by a bar and talked to its owner. He said he thought he left his car there and walked away, but he couldn't remember much beyond that because he had drunk a lot of alcohol. However, Craig admitted that he did indeed kill Michelle. He recalled taking her life. Realizing that such a vague confession wouldn't be enough, the fake boss proposed that Craig go to the crime scene with other gang members to refresh his memory. After that, his accomplices would take him to the airport and help him leave the country. Craig agreed, and once at the crime scene, he told how he dragged Michelle away from the road into some grass to hide her body. He added that he couldn't remember if he had assaulted her, but he detailed how he removed part of her clothing. He noted that the clasp on her bra was broken, an undisclosed detail that only the killer would have known. After that, Craig also confessed to attempting to assault another woman a year before Michelle's murder, but was interrupted by the victim's boyfriend. He described the incident in detail, providing information that confirmed the truthfulness of his account. After receiving the confession, the gang members did take Craig to the airport, but reinforcements were already waiting for him there. 20 years after the murder, Craig was arrested for Michelle's killing and was placed in jail awaiting trial. The trial began in 2023, with Craig facing charges for both Michelle's murder and the attempted assault on the other woman. He pleaded not guilty, and his lawyer argued that the confession had been obtained under pressure. The defense highlighted that Craig initially claimed his innocence to the undercover officers and only made a false confession out of fear for his safety. The prosecution, however, argued that Craig had always had a choice. He could have left the gang and remained silent about his involvement in the murder. Additionally, Craig had provided specific details, such as the manner of the killing and the broken clasp on Michelle's bra, which an innocent person would not have known. The prosecution's theory was that Craig had spotted Michelle on one of the central streets and either offered her a ride or walked her home. Since Michelle lived just a short distance from Craig and knew him well, it's likely she trusted him enough to accept a ride. Once they reached the outskirts of town, he may have attacked her and dragged her away from the road toward the railway tracks, where her body was ultimately found. The trial spanned 7 weeks, and in the end, Craig was convicted of Michelle's murder and the assault of the other woman. The second victim took the stand and identified him once again. Only this time, she no longer had to fear that he would escape justice. The judge sentenced Craig to 32 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 24. This means he may be eligible for release when he's 77 or older. For Michelle's family, who had spent years without answers. There was finally a sense of closure. They expressed deep gratitude to the detectives who had worked relentlessly to uncover the truth. The loss had left a lasting scar on their family. 6 years after Michelle's death, her parents divorced, and her mother continued to struggle with the pain of losing her daughter. Her father and brothers carried a heavy burden of guilt, believing they had failed to protect her. Now, with her killer behind bars, the family can take some comfort in knowing that he will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Moving on to the next case. Morgan Nick, a young girl from a small town, attended a Little League baseball game with her mother. While her mom watched from the stands, the girl wandered off to play with other children nearby. Though her mother kept a watchful eye from the bleachers, a single moment of distraction was all it took. When she looked back, her daughter was gone. The police were brought in quickly and soon uncovered several troubling leads. Yet for nearly 3 decades, the mystery of what happened to the girl remained unsolved, until just a few weeks ago, when long-awaited answers finally surfaced. Morgan Nick was born on September 12, 1988, in the quiet town of Ozark, Arkansas. After her birth, her family grew with the arrival of a baby brother, followed by a younger sister the next year. Morgan shared a close and loving bond with her siblings. They could spend hours playing together, and the younger children looked up to her with admiration. When Morgan began learning to read, she would often practice using children's books, lovingly reading bedtime stories to her little brother. From a young age, Morgan had a deep love for animals and often told her parents she wanted to become a veterinarian one day. During elementary school, she joined the Girl Scouts, where she enjoyed making crafts, exploring nature, and spending time with her peers. When Morgan was 6 years old, her parents divorced, but she and her siblings still had regular visits with their father. In the early summer of 1995, a family friend invited Morgan's mom to a Little League baseball game in the nearby town of Alma. Initially, she considered turning down the offer. It was a Friday evening, and the stadium was nearly 30 miles away. But ultimately, she decided to go and bring Morgan along, thinking it would be a nice way to share some time together. On the evening of June 9th, she left Morgan's younger siblings with their grandmother and headed to the stadium. Though the venue was small, around 300 people had gathered to watch the game, including many parents and children. Morgan's mom met up with her friends, and they settled in to enjoy the evening. It didn't take long for Morgan to grow restless. Before long, she spotted 2 kids she knew, and they invited her to join them in catching fireflies near the stadium. At first, her mother was hesitant. It was getting dark, and they were in an unfamiliar town, which made her uneasy. But her friends assured her that their children played in that area all the time and that it was perfectly safe. With some hesitation, she allowed Morgan to go. The young girl ran off excitedly with the other kids, stopping by a small hill still visible from the bleachers. Her mom checked on her periodically as the game continued. About 15 minutes later, the game wrapped up, and players began heading toward the stands to meet their families. Morgan's mom looked away momentarily, but when she turned her eyes back to the hill, Morgan was gone. The 2 children she had been playing with were walking back toward the bleachers, alone. The woman hurried over to the 2 children and asked if they had seen Morgan. They explained that before heading back to the stands, they had paused to shake the sand out of their shoes after playing. They walked over to a car in the parking lot, leaned against it, and emptied their shoes. Morgan was standing behind the car while they were at the front. Once they finished, they began walking back to the stadium, but Morgan was no longer with them. They assumed she had simply stayed near the car to wait for her mother and didn't think much of it as they continued on. Morgan's mom looked toward the parking area and quickly spotted her car, but Morgan was nowhere in sight. She ran over and checked inside, hoping to find her there, but the car was empty. Panic took hold as she rushed back to the kids, desperate for more information. She asked if they had any idea where Morgan might have gone, but they were just as confused. However, they did recall seeing a man in the parking lot while they were playing. The children told her about a man they had seen near a red pickup truck. He had been standing by the vehicle, watching the stadium and occasionally glancing in their direction. At one point, he even approached them and said something, though they couldn't recall exactly what, only that he had a country-sounding accent. Suspecting this man might be connected to her daughter's disappearance, Morgan's mother immediately contacted the police. Just 6 minutes later, officers arrived at the stadium and began speaking with the children who had been with Morgan before she vanished. As they interviewed the kids, police gathered more specific details about the man they had seen. Based on their combined accounts, investigators described him as a white male, estimated to be between 23 and 30 years old, approximately 6 feet tall, with a medium build, dark hair, a beard, and a mustache. The children also clearly remembered his vehicle, an older red pickup truck with Arkansas license plates and a white camper shell attached to the back. This detail raised immediate concern, as the camper shell could easily conceal an adult, let alone a child. Another odd thing was that the camper seemed unusually short for the truck, making it look out of place for that model. This raised further suspicion that the man might be directly involved in Morgan's disappearance and could have used the camper to abduct her. The kids also mentioned that the man was wearing only jeans and had no shirt on. The officers immediately searched the parking lot, but they couldn't find any vehicle matching the description. After speaking with the kids, they began questioning everyone who was still at the stadium. However, all of the 300 attendees had been focused on the game, and none of them recalled seeing anything strange or suspicious that evening. A search around the stadium also came up empty, so the officers expanded their efforts to the nearby streets. Despite their best efforts, no trace of Morgan was found that night. Her mother was devastated. She refused to go home and ended up spending the rest of the night at the fire station. The next day, the search intensified as news of Morgan's disappearance spread quickly throughout the area, prompting dozens of volunteers to come forward. Soon, the FBI and state police joined the efforts, providing helicopters for aerial searches and creating a suspect sketch based on Morgan's friends' descriptions. The sketch, along with photos of Morgan, was distributed across the town and nearby communities in the hopes that someone would recognize the man. Initially, the authorities also thought that Morgan might have simply wandered off from the parking lot and gotten lost. But as nearly 24 hours passed without any sign of her, it became clear that if that were the case, she would have been found by then. That evening, police also began receiving alarming reports from parents who shared some disturbing stories. One woman told them that just a few hours before the baseball game, a stranger had tried to lure her 4-year-old daughter into his red pickup truck. It happened near a laundromat in Alma while the woman was inside, and her daughter was standing near the building. When the mother came out, the man drove off. She provided a description of the suspect which matched the sketch of Morgan's possible abductor. The day after Morgan's disappearance, another report came in from a witness in Fort Smith, a town not far from Alma. He saw a man trying to lure a 9-year-old girl into a public restroom, but the girl managed to get away. Once again, the man's description matched the composite sketch based on the accounts from Morgan's friends. All of this pointed to the possibility that the person behind Morgan's disappearance might have previously attempted to abduct other victims or even successfully committed similar crimes in the past. The police focused on locating the red pickup truck matching the witness description and began checking the backgrounds of known offenders in nearby towns. Over the next few weeks, investigators received hundreds of tips about potential suspects, but they either couldn't establish a connection or confirm that the individuals had no involvement in the crime. Meanwhile, investigators continued to comb the area around the stadium, collecting various items that could potentially be considered as evidence. They found several cigarette butts, bottles, and other objects, which were sent to the lab for DNA analysis. But in the end, the police had no clear indication whether any of these items were actually connected to Morgan's disappearance. As for the red pickup truck, the police received nearly 250 calls from witnesses across various towns and even neighboring states, all reporting sightings of similar vehicles. The problem was that a lot of residents drove similar models, and there were literally thousands of them. Investigators tried to check each owner, but once again, they found no evidence linking any of them to Morgan's disappearance. This continued for 2 weeks until the police received a surprising call. A resident of a town called Stuttgart, about a 3-hour drive from Alma, was on his property when he noticed a man trying to break into his car. The homeowner scared him off, and the intruder immediately fled. When he was running away, the witness saw that the man was holding a little girl by the hand. The police showed him the composite sketch of the suspect, and he confirmed that the person trying to get into his car looked very similar to the suspect, and the girl resembled Morgan. Investigators quickly launched a large-scale operation in Stuttgart, securing an area of about 10 square miles and deploying several dozen officers. Morgan's parents immediately headed to the town, hoping their daughter would be finally found. Hundreds of volunteers, along with the police, began searching the entire town and surrounding area. Helicopters scanned from above, and search dogs tried to pick up Morgan's scent using her belongings. The search continued for 16 hours, but they found no trace of the missing girl. Eventually, the police began to doubt the witness's story. They conducted 2 polygraph tests, both of which suggested he was lying. Although the man insisted he was telling the truth, he eventually admitted that he had made up the entire story. He did see someone trying to break into his car, but he hadn't gotten a good look at the person's face, and there was no little girl with him. The man was arrested for providing false information, which cost nearly a full day of search efforts and thousands of dollars. It's unclear if he faced any punishment, but such actions typically result in a serious fine or a jail sentence. Investigators found themselves back at square one, but giving up wasn't an option. They brought in 17 more officers from across the state, and the team focused on sorting through the leads that kept coming in. By then, they had over 1,500 tips, but none of them brought detectives any closer to finding Morgan. Her parents didn't give up either, but as the months went by, their hopes started to fade. About a year after Morgan disappeared, her mom found a nonprofit dedicated to finding missing children. Although she was still focused on searching for her daughter, there weren't any new clues left to follow. That's when she began helping other families who were going through similar tragedies, and she put her efforts into raising awareness about the dangers that could strike at any moment in a child's life. Over the next several years, police kept following up on various leads and questioning potential suspects, but nothing seemed to bring any progress. In February 2001, 6 years after Morgan's disappearance, the FBI released an age-progressed image showing what she might look like. That same year, several well-known TV shows aired segments about her case, which led to an increase in the number of tips. Although most of these tips turned out to be dead ends, one in particular caught the investigators' attention. The caller claimed that the girl's body was buried on a property in Boonville, a small town about an hour from Alma. The police took this tip seriously because the person provided specific details about the case that had never been made public. In early 2002, they obtained a search warrant for the property. Bringing search dogs along, they dug up the entire area, but no trace of Morgan was found. Since then, the case remained cold for nearly a decade. In 2010, police received another tip about a possible location where Morgan's abductor might have held her, this time in another state. They conducted a search, but once again, there was no evidence to suggest the girl had ever been there. Interestingly, in 2017, police returned to search the same house, but this time for a different investigation. It turned out that a man who had once lived there was in prison for crimes against minors, and authorities suspected him in another similar case. But even then, the search turned up no new clues. In 2019, a new documentary about the case was released. For the first time since Morgan's disappearance, police shared of the red pickup truck believed to be connected to the abductor. The vehicle had been briefly captured on someone's camera during the game, but the poor quality and angle made it nearly impossible to make out any important details. Following the documentary's release, police reached out to the public, asking for any information about who might have owned the truck. They received a series of new tips, but despite these efforts, they still couldn't make any progress in solving the case. This continued until 2021, when investigators finally named their main suspect in the case. The man was Billy Lynx, who had come to the police's attention in the early weeks of Morgan's disappearance. Lynx had a criminal record for offenses against minors, and he owned a similar red pickup truck. However, in 1995, police could not establish any connection between him and Morgan's disappearance, even after searching his truck. During his questioning, they felt that Billy was being honest about his innocence. He was also significantly older than 30, while detectives relied on Morgan's friends' accounts that described the abductor as being younger. Now, nearly 30 years later, detectives began to look at him again. This time, they hoped that modern DNA analysis tools could uncover any traces of Morgan's presence in his vehicle. But there were some issues. Billy had passed away in 2000 while serving time for an attempted abduction. Just 2 months after Morgan's disappearance, he tried to lure another girl into his car while she was standing outside a store. Her mother scared him off and reported the incident to the police, leading to his arrest. At that time, He was 70 years old, and he died of natural causes 5 years later while still in prison. Another complication was that police had no idea where Billy's pickup truck was or if it even still existed after nearly 3 decades. The investigators focused on tracking down the pickup truck, and after some time, they managed to trace its chain of ownership since Billy's arrest. To the surprise of the detectives, they actually found the truck. It was still running, and the current owner agreed to let the police examine it. Initially, the detectives didn't get their hopes up too high, since any DNA evidence could have easily been erased or degraded over the years. But surprisingly, forensic experts found a few hairs in the truck bed that seemed to match Morgan's hair. The samples were sent to a Texas lab, equipped with the latest DNA analysis technology, for a closer look. It took 8 months, but finally, there was a breakthrough. They managed to extract a DNA sample from the hair and compared it to Morgan's mother's DNA. The results indicated a close genetic match in the first degree of relation. In other words, the hair likely belonged to one of her children or siblings. Morgan's mother stated that she had never heard of Billy Lynx and had never met him in her life. Detectives also knew that no one else from Morgan's immediate family could have been in that truck, which meant that the little girl herself must have been there. On October 1st, 2024, the police held a press conference to announce that Billy Lynx was now officially considered responsible for Morgan's abduction, and they had no doubt about his involvement. Unfortunately, no one believes that Morgan could still be alive nearly 29 years after her disappearance. Investigators suspect that Billy killed her in the first few days after the abduction, but where he hid her remains is still unknown. Even though the case is considered essentially solved, the police have declared that they will continue searching for her remains. Still, without a confession from Billy, this task seems nearly impossible. Detectives also plan to investigate Billy's potential connection to other cases. Given that he had attempted multiple kidnappings shortly after Morgan went missing, authorities believe there may be additional crimes in his past. At the time of Morgan's abduction, Billy was already 70 years old, suggesting the possibility of a lengthy history of similar offenses. His background in the military during World War II may have also provided him with skills that could have aided in carrying out such crimes. Morgan's disappearance would go on to become one of the most widely recognized criminal cases in Arkansas history. In her memory, state officials even renamed the Amber Alert system to the Morgan Alert. As for her mother, she has dedicated her life to helping other missing children and their families through a nonprofit organization she founded. This mission has become her way of managing the pain of losing Morgan. And while the years have passed, a small part of her still clings to hope that somehow her daughter might still be alive. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into cold case investigations. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.